The clock on the kitchen wall ticked steadily, its rhythmic sound marking the passage of a late summer afternoon. A warm, golden light filtered through the blinds, casting a soft glow over the familiar surroundings of my home. The walls, adorned with faded family photos, spoke of years gone by, and the scent of coffee lingered in the air, mixing with the smell of freshly cut grass outside. It was a peaceful scene, almost idyllic, but beneath the calm surface, I could feel an unsettling undercurrent. I sat at the kitchen table, mindlessly stirring my cup of coffee, feeling more out of place in my own home than I ever had before. At 22, I had long since become accustomed to the ebb and flow of life in this house, my house. Yet, the arrival of Ethan, my new stepbrother, had shifted everything. He wasn't like the others who had come and gone, and there was something about him that unsettled me in a way I couldn't fully explain. Ethan was 18, just a few years younger than me, but his presence seemed to dominate every room he walked into. His dark hair was always just a little too messy, his sharp blue eyes a little too perceptive, and his quiet demeanor a little too calculating. He had an almost magnetic quality, one that pulled me in despite my desire to keep my distance. He was everything I wasn't: confident, charming, carefree, and it was maddening. For some reason, it made me feel small, invisible, like I wasn't even worthy of his attention. I tried not to pay too much attention to him, but the tension was palpable. It was in the way he looked at me sometimes, like he knew something I didn't, or maybe something I refused to acknowledge. Every time our eyes met, I felt a jolt of recognition, like I was standing on the edge of something both thrilling and dangerous. I couldn't tell if he was playing some kind of game with me or if I was the one making things up in my head. But I knew this: whatever was happening between us, I couldn't let it consume me. I had enough on my plate as it was. In my small circle of friends, I had always been the reliable one, the one who kept things together. At school, I was the quiet, studious type who preferred the comfort of books over parties. I had a part-time job at the local bookstore, where I worked after classes, and I spent my free time writing short stories. My world was small, but it was safe. Or so I thought. When my mom married Ethan's dad, I had hoped that it wouldn't disrupt the balance of my life. But it didn't take long for that hope to wither away. Ethan's family was different. His dad was loud, boisterous, and always the center of attention, while his mom was quiet and distant. They had lived in several cities before settling here, and Ethan, despite his seemingly perfect facade, was a product of that instability. He had a quiet sadness about him, something I could sense every time we shared a conversation. He wasn't the carefree, arrogant teenager he appeared to be. There was more beneath the surface. But I couldn't get close enough to figure it out. At least, that's what I told myself. I didn't want him. At first, I convinced myself that any attraction I might have felt toward Ethan was simply a product of the sudden change in our living arrangements, that it was just confusion or curiosity. But the more I spent time around him, the more I started to recognize the feelings I was trying to suppress. There was something about his presence that stirred something deep within me, something I had never felt before. Every time he was near, my heart raced, my thoughts scattered, and I couldn't breathe properly. The way he moved, the way he spoke, the way he looked at me when he thought I wasn't paying attention, it all unsettled me in the most intoxicating way. I had to keep my distance. I knew the boundaries, knew how dangerous it would be to cross them. We were family now, and that meant keeping my emotions in check, no matter how strong they were. But Ethan seemed to understand the unspoken tension between us in a way that made me feel exposed. He would throw little comments my way, light teasing that was always just enough to make me question my resolve. It wasn't until that day, when the storm of emotions inside me reached a breaking point, that everything began to change. It was a Saturday evening, and the house was quiet for once. My mom and her husband were out for the night, leaving Ethan and me alone in the house. The atmosphere was thick with the unspoken, our proximity making every breath feel like a weight on my chest. He was sitting on the couch, his feet resting on the coffee table, eyes glued to the TV, while I sat across from him, pretending to read a book. But I wasn't reading. Ethan had been different that day, distant, almost brooding. It wasn't like him. He wasn't usually one to hide away, to keep to himself, but I could sense something was off. Maybe it was the late-night conversations he'd been having with his father, or maybe it was something else entirely. But whatever it was, it had put a strange tension in the air, one I couldn't ignore any longer. "Are you okay?" I finally asked, breaking the silence. My voice was quieter than I intended, but I couldn't help it. Ethan looked at me, his expression unreadable. For a moment, he didn't speak, and I almost regretted asking. Then, to my surprise, he sighed deeply and set the remote down. "Do you ever feel like you're not living your own life?" he asked, his tone almost too vulnerable. It was a question that hit too close to home, and I knew, deep down, that whatever came next would change everything. Ethan's question lingered in the air, heavy and unshakable. "Do you ever feel like you're not living your own life?" It was the kind of question that required a careful answer, one that would reveal too much if I wasn't careful. I could feel my pulse quicken, a mix of curiosity and unease brewing in my chest. Why was he asking me this? I met his gaze, trying to sound calm. "Sometimes," I admitted. "I think everyone does, though." "Why?" He shrugged, leaning back against the couch, but his posture betrayed him. He was guarded, protective of whatever vulnerability had prompted the question. "No reason," he said casually, but there was a tremor in his voice that suggested otherwise. I wanted to push him, to ask what he meant, but something held me back. Maybe it was the fear that his answer would be too raw, too real, or maybe it was my own reluctance to confront the truth I had been avoiding for weeks. Instead, I let the silence stretch between us, hoping he might speak again. But he didn't. The next few days passed uneventfully, but the tension between us grew. Ethan became more withdrawn, spending hours in his room or out of the house altogether. At first, I thought he might just need space, but then I started noticing the little things. The way he avoided eye contact, the way his jokes lost their sharp edge, the way his usual confident demeanor seemed to falter. I told myself it wasn't my problem, that I didn't need to get involved. But the truth was, I couldn't stop thinking about him. One evening, I decided to talk to my mom about it. She was in the kitchen, chopping vegetables for dinner, her movements methodical and deliberate. "Have you noticed anything different about Ethan lately?" I asked, trying to sound casual. She paused, her knife hovering midair, and gave me a curious look. "Different how?" "I don't know. He just seems off," I said, searching for the right words. "Quieter than usual. Like something's bothering him." My mom sighed, setting the knife down and wiping her hands on a towel. "Ethan's been through a lot," she said. "Moving here hasn't been easy for him, and I think he's still trying to find his place. Just give him some time." I nodded, but her answer didn't satisfy me. There was something she wasn't saying, something she was holding back, and it only made me more determined to figure out what was going on. The next day, I caught Ethan on his way out the door. He was wearing his usual leather jacket, his hair tousled in that effortlessly cool way that made me envy him even more. "Hey," I called, stepping into his path. "Where are you going?" He hesitated, his hand on the doorknob. "Out," he said simply. "Out where? Why do you care?" The question stung more than I expected, and for a moment, I considered letting it go. But then I remembered the way he had opened up to me that night, the way his voice had wavered when he asked if I ever felt like I wasn't living my own life. "I care because you're my stepbrother," I said, forcing myself to hold his gaze. "And because I can tell something's wrong, even if you won't admit it." For a moment, I thought he might brush me off again. But then, to my surprise, he sighed and stepped back, letting the door swing shut behind him. "Fine," he said. "If you really want to know, I'm going to see someone." "Someone used to know." "Used to know?" He nodded, his expression unreadable. "Yeah. It's complicated." Complicated. That word hung between us, heavy with implication. I wanted to press him for details, but I could tell he wasn't ready to share. "Do you want me to come with you?" I asked, surprising even myself with the offer. Ethan looked at me, his blue eyes narrowing slightly. For a moment he seemed to be considering it, but then he shook his head. "No. This is something I need to do on my own." I watched him go, a knot of worry tightening in my chest. There was something about the way he said it, something final, almost ominous, that made me feel like I should have pushed harder. Later that night, when Ethan still hadn't come home, I found myself pacing the living room, my anxiety mounting with every passing hour. What if something had happened to him? What if he was in trouble? Just as I was about to grab my keys and go looking for him, the front door creaked open and Ethan stepped inside. He looked exhausted, his face pale and his eyes rimmed with red. "Where were you?" I demanded, my worry quickly turning to anger. Ethan didn't answer right away. Instead, he dropped his jacket onto the floor and collapsed onto the couch, rubbing his hands over his face. "I saw someone I shouldn't have," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "What does that mean?" "It means I made a mistake," he said, his voice cracking. "And now I don't know how to fix it." I sat down beside him, my anger fading as I saw the pain etched across his face. "Ethan," I said softly, "you can talk to me. Whatever it is, we'll figure it out together." He looked at me then, his eyes filled with a vulnerability I had never seen before. And for the first time, I realized just how deeply he had been hurting and how much I wanted to help him, no matter the cost. The house was eerily quiet, the soft hum of the refrigerator the only sound breaking the silence. Ethan sat on the edge of the couch, his elbows resting on his knees and his head hanging low. His jacket was crumpled on the floor beside him, the leather worn and frayed at the edges. His presence seemed to fill the room, heavy with an unspoken truth. I stood a few feet away, unsure of how to begin. I'd seen Ethan like this before, guarded, distant, but never this broken. He hadn't said a word since he walked through the door, and the weight of whatever he was carrying was suffocating. "Ethan," I said softly, taking a tentative step closer. "Talk to me. Please." For a moment, he didn't move, didn't even acknowledge my presence. But then he let out a deep, shuddering breath and raised his head. His eyes met mine, and what I saw there stopped me in my tracks. They weren't just sad, they were filled with anguish, a raw, unfiltered pain that I hadn't realized he was capable of feeling. "I messed up," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I thought I could handle it, but I can't. I don't know what to do." I knelt in front of him, desperate to close the distance between us. "What happened? Who did you see?" Ethan's jaw tightened, and he looked away, his gaze fixed on the floor. "Someone I used to be with," he admitted. "Before we moved here. Before everything." The confession hit me like a punch to the gut, not because it surprised me, but because of the vulnerability it carried. Ethan was always so composed, so in control, and seeing him like this was almost too much to bear. "Did they hurt you?" I asked, my voice trembling. He shook his head. "No, it's not like that. It's more complicated." There was that word again, complicated. It had become a refrain, a shield he used to keep me at arm's length. But I wasn't going to let him push me away this time. "Ethan, I need you to be honest with me," I said firmly. "What's going on? Why you like this?" His eyes snapped back to mine, and for a moment, I thought he was going to shut me out again. But then, to my surprise, he leaned forward, his hands gripping the edge of the couch so tightly that his knuckles turned white. "Because I don't know who I am anymore," he burst out, his voice raw with emotion. "I've spent my whole life trying to be what everyone else wanted me to be, cool, confident, easygoing, but it's all a lie. I'm not any of those things. I'm just lost." The words hung in the air, a confession so bare and honest that it left me speechless. I had always thought of Ethan as untouchable, someone who didn't let the world get to him. But now I could see just how wrong I had been. "You're not lost," I said quietly. "You're just scared." He laughed bitterly. "Scared of what? I've already lost everything that mattered to me. What else is there to be afraid of?" "Of being seen," I said, surprising even myself with the intensity of my words. "Of letting someone in. Of admitting that you're not okay." Ethan's eyes widened, and for a moment, I thought I might have gone too far. But then he exhaled shakily and dropped his head into his hands. "I'm so tired," he whispered. "Tired of pretending, tired of running, tired of..." I didn't know what possessed me to do it, but I reached out and placed a hand on his shoulder. The contact was electric, a spark that sent a jolt through both of us. Ethan froze, his body rigid under my touch, and for a moment, I thought he might pull away. But then he looked up, and the expression on his face was one I would never forget, equal parts fear and longing, as if he was standing on the edge of a cliff and I was the only thing keeping him from falling. "You don't have to pretend with me," I said softly. "I see you, Ethan. All of you. And I'm not going anywhere." The words were out before I could stop them, and the moment they left my mouth, I knew there was no taking them back. Ethan's eyes searched mine, his breath hitching as he processed what I had just said. "Do you mean that?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "Yes," I said without hesitation. "I mean it." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The air between us crackled with unspoken tension, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. Then, slowly, Ethan reached out and placed his hand over mine. The gesture was small, almost imperceptible, but it was enough to break the dam that had been holding back everything we had been too afraid to say. "I'm scared," he admitted, his voice trembling. "Of what this means. Of what happens next." "So am I," I said. "But we'll figure it out. Together." And in that moment, something shifted between us. The barriers we had built to protect ourselves came crashing down, leaving us exposed but no longer alone. Ethan leaned forward, his forehead resting against mine, and for the first time, I felt a sense of peace, a quiet certainty that no matter what challenges lay ahead, we would face them together. "I don't know what I'd do without you," he whispered. "You'll never have to find out," I replied. And with that, the weight of the world seemed to lift, leaving only the two of us, connected in a way that was both terrifying and beautiful. The days that followed were like walking on newly thawed ice, fragile, unfamiliar, and fraught with uncertainty. But for the first time since Ethan had moved in, the tension between us wasn't something I wanted to escape. Instead, it became a thread binding us together, one we were finally brave enough to hold on to. We talked late into the night, the walls we had built crumbling brick by brick. Ethan shared stories he had never told anyone before, of the loneliness that came with moving from place to place, the pressure to meet everyone's expectations, and the constant fear that if anyone saw the real him, they would walk away. "I always thought I had to be what people wanted," he admitted one evening as we sat on the back porch, the night sky stretching endlessly above us. "Like if I wasn't perfect, they'd leave. And they always did anyway." I didn't know how to respond at first, the weight of his confessions settling over us like a blanket. But then I reached out and took his hand, my fingers curling around his. "I'm not going anywhere," I said, the words firm and unshakable. "No matter what." Ethan looked at me, his expression softening in a way I hadn't seen before. "I believe you," he said quietly, and the simple admission felt like a victory. But as much as we had started to open up to each other, the world around us didn't stop spinning. My mom noticed the shift in our dynamic almost immediately, her eyes narrowing every time she saw us together. She didn't say anything outright, but her subtle glances and furrowed brows spoke volumes. It wasn't until a Sunday dinner, with Ethan's dad at the table, that the tension boiled over. Ethan and I had been joking about something inconsequential, our laughter filling the small dining room, when his dad cleared his throat loudly. "You two seem awfully close these days," he said, his tone heavy with implication. The room fell silent, the air thick with unspoken accusations. My mom shot me a look, her expression somewhere between confusion and concern, while Ethan froze, his fork halfway to his mouth. "We're family," I said quickly, trying to defuse the situation. "It's only natural that we get along." His dad didn't look convinced. "Family is one thing," he said, his voice low. "But there's such a thing as boundaries." The words hung in the air, a sharp reminder of the line we had crossed. I felt my face flush, my heart pounding in my chest, but Ethan was the one who broke the silence. "Maybe if you'd been around more, you'd know what it's like to actually care about someone," he said coldly, his words cutting through the tension like a knife. His dad's face darkened, but before he could respond, Ethan pushed his chair back and stood. "I'm done here," he muttered, storming out of the room. I hesitated, torn between staying and following him, but my mom's voice stopped me. "Go," she said softly, her eyes filled with understanding. "He needs you." I didn't need to be told twice. I found Ethan in the backyard, leaning against the old oak tree at the edge of the property. The cool evening air carried the scent of freshly cut grass, and the soft chirping of crickets filled the silence. I shouldn't have said that, he said as I approached, his voice heavy with regret. Maybe not, I admitted, stepping closer, but you're not wrong. Ethan glanced at me, his expression conflicted. I'm tired of pretending everything's fine, he said. I'm tired of keeping everything bottled up just to make other people comfortable. Then don't, I said simply. You don't owe anyone an explanation for being yourself. He looked at me, his blue eyes filled with a mix of gratitude and vulnerability. You really mean that, don't you? Every word. For a moment, we just stood there, the weight of everything we had been through settling around us. And then, without warning, Ethan stepped forward and wrapped his arms around me, pulling me into a tight embrace. I don't know what I did to deserve you, he whispered, his voice trembling. You don't have to deserve me, I said, my own voice thick with emotion. We're in this together, no matter what. In the days that followed, we began to rebuild, not just our relationship, but ourselves. Ethan started opening up to my mom, sharing pieces of his story that he had kept hidden for years. She listened with quiet understanding, her initial concerns melting away as she began to see the person Ethan truly was. As for me, I finally found the courage to confront my own fears. I stopped hiding behind the safety of my routines, started taking risks I never would have before. And while the path we were on was anything but easy, I knew we were stronger for having faced it together. By the time autumn rolled around, the house felt like a different place, warmer, brighter, filled with a sense of belonging that hadn't been there before. And while there were still challenges ahead, I knew one thing for certain. We had broken through the barriers that once divided us, and there was no going back. Ethan and I weren't just stepbrothers anymore. We were something more, something deeper, and the bond we had forged was unbreakable. Months later, as I sat on the porch watching the autumn leaves drift lazily to the ground, I realized how much my world had changed. Ethan was sitting beside me, his guitar resting on his lap as he strummed a quiet, improvised melody. The air carried the faint scent of wood smoke, and the golden hues of the setting sun bathed everything in a warm glow. It wasn't just the season that had shifted, it was me. For so long, I had lived in the confines of my own fear, keeping people at arm's length and pretending I was content with surface-level connections. Ethan's arrival had upended all of that. He was a force of nature, someone who challenged my assumptions and pulled me out of my comfort zone, even when I wasn't ready. Looking back, I realized how much I had misjudged him at first. I saw his confidence as arrogance, his independence as aloofness. But underneath it all was someone who was just as scared and uncertain as I was, someone who had spent years hiding his true self because the world had taught him it wasn't safe to be vulnerable. And yet, against all odds, we had found a way to trust each other. I thought about the night Ethan had opened up to me, the way his voice had trembled as he admitted his fears. It was the first time I truly saw him, not the version he showed the world, but the real Ethan, flawed and beautiful in ways I hadn't expected. In that moment, something shifted in me. I realized that love wasn't about perfection or certainty, it was about connection, about being willing to stand beside someone even when everything else felt uncertain. Ethan's voice broke through my thoughts, pulling me back to the present. You've been quiet, he said, glancing at me with a small smile. What's on your mind? I hesitated, unsure of how to put my feelings into words. But then I remembered how far we had come, how much we had learned about ourselves and each other. If there was one thing Ethan had taught me, it was the importance of speaking my truth, even when it felt uncomfortable. I was just thinking about how different things are now, I said finally. How different I am. He raised an eyebrow, his fingers stilling on the strings of his guitar. Different how? I smiled, leaning back against the porch railing. I don't know. I feel lighter, I guess. Like I'm not carrying around so much fear anymore. Ethan nodded, his expression thoughtful. You've changed, he said after a moment. But in a good way. You're stronger. More open. Because of you, I admitted, my voice soft. Ethan's gaze met mine, and for a moment, we sat in silence, the unspoken connection between us stronger than any words could convey. I think we both helped each other, he said finally. You showed me it's okay to let people in. That I don't have to do everything alone. Hearing him say those words felt like a full circle moment. We had started as two people who couldn't have been more different, Me, reserved and cautious. Him, bold and unpredictable. And yet, through the twists and turns of our journey, we had found a way to meet in the middle, to build something that felt unshakable. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I thought about the lessons we had learned along the way. I thought about the courage it took to confront our fears, the strength it took to be vulnerable, and the beauty of finding connection in the most unexpected places. But most of all, I thought about how love, real, messy, imperfect love, had the power to change everything. It wasn't just the romantic kind of love, though that was part of it. It was the love that came from truly seeing someone, from understanding their pain and standing beside them anyway. It was the love that grew from shared laughter and quiet moments, from the hard conversations and the even harder silences. Ethan set his guitar aside and leaned back, his shoulder brushing against mine. "You know," he said, his voice low and thoughtful, "for all the crap we went through, I wouldn't change any of it. Not a single thing." "Me neither," I said, and I meant it. In the quiet that followed, I felt a profound sense of peace. The challenges we had faced weren't easy, and the road ahead wouldn't be either. But I knew now that we could handle it, together. As the first stars began to dot the sky, I found myself reflecting on something Ethan had said to me once, back when things were still uncertain. "Do you ever feel like you're not living your own life?" I had felt that way for so long, trapped by my own insecurities and doubts. But now, as I sat beside Ethan, I realized that I finally was. And it felt like freedom.